All right, welcome back to my channel, True Crime Fans. I'm your host, Tim Solberg, and today I am going to bring you a case that's been ongoing for 6 years. Let me start off with the victims. We've got Libby German and Abby Williams. The suspect in the case is Richard Allen, and the location is going to be Delphi, Indiana. Now, this case is very interesting to me. I think this is one of the more interesting cases because of the timeline, because of what happened to these girls, and because of the evidence that's been brought forward so far, at least in the arrest affidavits. I am just not entirely convinced that our suspect has some smoking gun evidence that's going to put them away. Now, I'm not saying that it's not the right suspect. I'm just saying I'm very interested to see what happens in this case when it finally goes to trial. So on that note, let's go back to the very beginning. We're going to talk about February 13th, 2017, when Libby and Abby are dropped off by a family member at the park, which is going to be the historical park in Delphi, Indiana. Now, this park is going to have trails. This park is going to have woods. This park is going to have a train trestle and many other things that you would find in a typical park. Now, they're going there to spend essentially a few hours because they're scheduled to be picked up at 5:30, so essentially 4 hours there. And we're not quite sure what they all did while they were there, but we do know based off of the phone that was found that there were some pictures taken near the train trestle. Okay, so at 5:30 p.m., the family member shows back up at the park, and neither Libby or Abby show up to the agreed upon space. So that night, there's a search party that goes out, and to that point, police haven't released any information or have alluded to any foul play that's happened. Now, a night goes by. On the 14th, they're back out there searching. The police come forward and basically say at that point that they do suspect that there's foul play. Now, we don't quite know exactly why, but we're assuming they may have found something, or the inclination was that the girls hadn't come home in that period of time, so they suspected foul play. Now, a couple of days later, about a half a mile down the river, they do find the bodies of Abby and Libby. So at this point, the case is ruled a double homicide. So throughout the next 5 years, a couple of things happened. Not a lot of information comes out on the case. There is a video that's released from the phone that actually shows the suspect in question crossing the train bridge and essentially saying down the hill to the girls. Now, it's a very small portion of the video. Obviously, the police don't want to release too much information because once they get a suspect, they want to have the evidence to be able to put the suspect away. Now, at that point, Keegan Kline ends up becoming a suspect. A big reason is because his profile, Anthony Schatz, is essentially communicating back and forth with Libby online, right? So that's something that's pretty huge that's going to happen. He becomes a suspect. He ends up having to give his phone, which I believe was an iPhone 5C, to the police, and then the police find that there was a lot of information that was deleted, but they were able to find some information. Now, Keegan was brought in for questioning a couple of times, but was never officially a suspect. He was a person of interest. Now, throughout that time, we did see the reward go from $40,000 to over $100,000. We did see that the families were pleading for any witnesses out there to come forward, and we did know that there was 3 girls on the trail that day as well that did see or state that they saw somebody out there, but they weren't sure if it was tied to the case or not. Okay. We also heard that a witness saw a dark-colored, quote-unquote, purple-like looking car that was parked by the water tower, essentially, or the utility building when they drove by around the time that the girls may or may not have disappeared. Now, keep in mind, this time frame's pretty long, right? 1:30 to 5:30, that's a 4-hour time frame, so a lot of stuff happens during that time. Okay. So you fast forward 5 years, and suddenly we get an arrest and we get a suspect for the case, which is essentially Richard Allen. Now, what do we know about Richard Allen? He lived in Delphi, Indiana. He was a pharmaceutical representative at one of the local stores. And we know that Richard Allen did come forward 5 years prior to what we think is a conservation officer. But in the arrest affidavit, it says to the authorities. So we're not quite sure if he went to the police department or he talked to a conservation officer, but essentially at that time he said that he was at the park right around the time that the girls go missing, okay, and are essentially killed. Okay, a couple of things that pop up in the arrest affidavit is that Richard Allen does own a blue jacket, which ends up being a Carhartt jacket that is similar to the one in the video. Also has a pair of pants that look the same and some shoes that look the same to the person that's in that video and was wearing headgear. Now, Richard Allen does state that he was at the park and he was looking down for a large period of time, so he wasn't paying attention to everybody that was passing him, but he does say that he saw 3 young ladies that were in the park, and he looked up and didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary for that. Now, another piece of evidence that come up in the police affidavit is that there was a random casing that was found near the bodies of Libby and Abby. It's said to be in between the 2 bodies and that it has a high potential of matching Richard Allen's gun. Now, the casing wasn't a fired bullet, but it was an actual casing with the bullet still intact. The markings that they're talking about is essentially that casing being dechambered or coming out of the gun, right? And that matches any bullet that would be put into that specific gun. And that gun has been retrieved by law enforcement. Now, none of this is smoking gun evidence at this point. This is all circumstantial. Now, does it look bad? I'm going to ask you, do you think Richard Allen had something to do with this? Do you think he's the right suspect? Do you think that Keegan Kline had something to do with this, especially since he was communicating with the girls prior to their disappearance? Or a lot of web sleuths out there believe that they may have been working together. And then the last option is, do you think somebody else had something to do with this crime? Okay, so these are all great questions. You're much smarter than me, so I'd love to hear what you have to say. Put a comment down below. I would love to hear some of the theories that are out there. Okay, so there's one other piece of evidence that I think could tilt this case in either the favor of Richard Allen or could prove him guilty, and that is going to be the voice analysis of that video. Now, we know that voice analysis can be very similar to fingerprints, can be very similar to DNA, and that could really lead to more smoking gun evidence that's going to show the jury and ultimately show the families of Libby and Abby who was responsible for this murder. Now, if it does come back that it wasn't Richard Allen, then that's going to leave them back at step 1, and that is going to be tragedy for the family. However, if Richard Allen is innocent, then he should be proven innocent and walk, because we know that you're only guilty once you've been proven guilty, and you're always innocent until that day comes. But with all the evidence pointing his way, I again want to hear from you folks. Do you think that he's the one that did it? The last thing I want to hit on is, here's the images of the sketch, and I want to know from you, do you think that Richard Allen or Keegan Kline match either of the sketches that the police had put out in the previous 5 years? And I think this is going to be very interesting, because I think this could either be beneficial for the prosecutors if the sketches are close, or beneficial for the defense if the sketches aren't close, right? And I think that because they've looked at a couple of different persons of interest, that could also play in the defense's case as well. So again, I want to hear from you folks. What do you think is going on? I know that there's a lot of information going on in this case. I highly suggest you go back and look at the timeline, as the timeline goes almost day by day, especially during the first part of this case. And then the case goes cold essentially for almost 5 years. And now we're back onto a suspect. Do you think that that is the right suspect that they have in custody right now? And do you think that they're going to end up finding Richard Allen guilty based off of what we've seen in the arrest affidavit so far? And I will state this, not everything is put into the arrest affidavit. There's only 8.5 pages there, but there is some very compelling evidence. no smoking gun evidence yet that we can see in there. So what are we going to see at trial? Very interesting. And we do know that the defense did request that they push it back so that way they could go through and do their discovery as well. So it's going to be an interesting case for sure. So on that note, I want to remind you, hit that like down below. We are growing. Love to hear some comments from you folks. You're what keeps me going. This is a passion project for us. If there's any feedback to try to improve on our videos, whether that be sound quality, whether that be the video itself, or even the cases we're bringing, I would love to hear from you. And again, I'm your host, Tim Solberg. I hope everybody has a great week, and that's me over and out.